You've been lied to. For generations, they've fed you a sanitized fairy tale, a colorful piper in bright clothing, dancing rats following his melody, children skipping merrily behind him into a magical mountain. Disney gave you animation. The Brothers Grimm gave you whimsy. Your childhood storybooks gave you comfort. They gave you everything except the truth. The real story isn't about magic. It's about mass death. It's about children who vanished forever from the face of the earth, leaving behind only empty beds and grieving mothers whose screams echoed through medieval streets. It's about a town that buried its shame so deep beneath layers of myth and folklore that we've forgotten we're walking over a mass grave of innocence. The Pied Piper of Hamelin isn't a children's story. It's a crime scene report, disguised as entertainment and fed to you as bedtime comfort. Every time you've heard this tale, every time it's been read to a sleepy child, you've been participating in a cover-up that's lasted over 700 years. The truth is this. In the year 1284, in the German town of Hamelin, 130 children disappeared. Not into a mountain. Not following a magical piper. They vanished into the brutal machinery of medieval survival, ground up by forces so horrific that the survivors could only cope by inventing a fantasy to replace their reality. Disease, forced migration, systematic exploitation, child trafficking, mass starvation. These are the real villains of our story. The Piper? He's a convenient fiction, a colorful distraction painted over bloodstains that never fully washed away. You want to know how we know this really happened? Because they carved it in stone. In the very walls of Hamelin, they inscribed the date. June 26, 1284, the day the children disappeared. Not the day they followed a piper into a mountain. The day they were lost forever to forces the survivors couldn't name, couldn't face, couldn't survive remembering. So they invented a story. They created a villain who could be blamed and dismissed. They wrapped their trauma in melody and magic, and they passed it down through generations who gradually forgot they were inheriting a lie built on the bones of children. Tonight, we're going to unwrap that lie. We're going to walk the actual streets where it happened. We're going to breathe the air those children breathed, smell what they smelled, feel what they felt in their final moments of innocence before they were swallowed by history. But first, you need to understand the world that devoured them. Narrator, close your eyes and step into the year 1284. Leave behind everything you know about childhood, about safety, about protection. Leave behind your assumptions about civilization and human decency. You are standing on the outskirts of Hamelin, a walled fortress of desperation clinging to the banks of the Weser River. The morning mist rises from the water, carrying with it the stench of human waste, rotting fish, and something else, something sweet and cloying that catches in your throat. It's the smell of death, always present, always waiting. The town walls loom before you, built not just to keep enemies out, but to contain the suffering within. 1,500 souls packed into a space barely large enough for half that number, pressed together like animals in a pen, breathing each other's diseases, sharing each other's desperation. Your feet sink into mud that isn't just mud. It's a mixture of earth, animal dung, human waste, and the decomposed remains of whatever the townspeople have thrown into the streets. The wet slap of bare feet on cobblestones echoes around you, the sound of survival, of people who can't afford shoes, who walk through filth because they have no choice. Listen, the soundscape of medieval Hamelin assaults your ears. Church bells clang incessantly, marking not just the hours, but the deaths, another soul released from this earthly hell. Dogs bark with the desperate hunger of creatures who compete with humans for scraps. Merchants shout in Middle-Low German, their voices hoarse from breathing air thick with smoke and disease. And underneath it all, a sound that never stops. The groans of the sick. They echo from every doorway, every window, every shadowed corner where the dying have crawled to escape the judgment of the healthy. The streets are unpaved rivers of misery. Ankle-deep in refuse, they wind between houses that lean against each other like drunken mourners. The wooden walls are blackened with soot and damp, stained with the evidence of lives lived too close together, of privacy sacrificed to survival. Rats. They're everywhere, skittering through cellars, racing along gutters, their red eyes reflecting the dim light of tallow candles. They're not just pests, they're harbingers. Where rats gather, disease follows. And in Hamelin, the rats have made themselves at home. The air itself is a weapon, thick with the tang of vinegar, the townspeople's futile attempt to ward off infection. The sharp reek of burning tallow mingles with the metallic stench of blood from butchered animals left exposed on market stalls. The sour smell of unwashed linen hangs heavy, mixed with the sweet corruption of rotting vegetables and the acrid smoke from fires that burn day and night. Step closer to the houses. Press your face against the blackened wood and listen. Inside, families huddle together in spaces no larger than closets. Children sleep 3 and 4 to a bed, their small bodies pressed against parents who may not survive the night. The clammy touch of damp walls, the scratch of straw mattresses infested with lice, the constant drip of water through roofs that offer no real shelter from the elements. This is childhood in medieval Hamelin, not playground games and lullabies. Hunger that gnaws at small bellies until children learn to stop crying because tears change nothing. Cold that penetrates to the bone, that makes fingers too numb to work, that kills the weak while they sleep. The plague is always here. Sometimes it retreats to the shadows, sometimes it sweeps through like a harvesting scythe, but it never truly leaves. Mass graves outside the town gates fill and are covered, only to be dug again when the next wave hits. The high-pitched squeal of rats mingles with the wails of mothers who wake to find their children cold and still. Laws exist, but they serve only the powerful. Children have no rights, no protection, no voice. They are property, labor, burdens to be fed when food is available, to be sacrificed when it's not. The local burghers, the wealthy merchants who control the town, make decisions based on profit and survival, not compassion. And in this world of perpetual crisis, where death is commonplace and suffering is the natural state of existence, something happened that was so horrific, so unthinkable, that the survivors could only cope by forgetting it entirely. 130 children, gone in a single day. Vanished from streets where every footstep was tracked, every face was known, every child was counted because children were too precious to lose. But they were lost, all of them. And in the silence that followed, in the empty spaces where laughter should have been, the survivors began to whisper stories. Stories that grew into legends, legends that hardened into lies. The mountain didn't swallow those children. The earth didn't open to receive them. They were consumed by something far more mundane and infinitely more terrible. The brutal machinery of human survival in an age when children were expendable and truth was too painful to bear. The criminal who stalked Hamelin's narrow streets was not the fantastical figure of later folklore, but a predator far more insidious, a human trafficker operating within the brutal machinery of medieval colonization. These locators, as they were known in administrative documents, moved through German towns like carrion birds, their gaudy clothing designed to catch the eye of the desperate and the young. The man who appeared in Hamelin wore a coat of parti-colored wool, each patch deliberately chosen to create an almost hypnotic visual effect. Crimson squares alternating with deep forest green, golden yellow bleeding into midnight blue. The entire garment shimmering in the morning light as he positioned himself near the town fountain, where children gathered to draw water. The coat itself was a calculated tool of psychological manipulation, its bright colors serving multiple purposes. It marked him as someone of apparent wealth and status, distinguished him from the drab browns and grays worn by the townsfolk, and created an almost carnival-like atmosphere that drew curious children like moths to flame. His instrument, a wooden pipe carved with intricate patterns and inlaid with small mirrors that caught and reflected sunlight, was equally deliberate in its construction. The music he produced was not magical, but expertly crafted to exploit the neurological responses of developing minds. Medieval locators understood, through generations of trial and error, that certain musical intervals and rhythmic patterns could induce a trance-like state in susceptible individuals, particularly children whose brains were still forming critical pathways. The pipe's haunting melody, built around specific frequencies that resonated with the human auditory processing system, created a form of acoustic hypnosis that made his young victims more compliant and suggestible. Behind this theatrical presentation lay a vast network of human exploitation that stretched across the Holy Roman Empire. German princes and bishops, hungry for settlers to populate their newly conquered territories in the east, had created a lucrative market for human cargo. The expansion into Prussia, Pomerania, and Transylvania required massive numbers of colonists, farmers, laborers, soldiers, and servants, to establish German settlements and maintain control over conquered Slavic populations. Local officials, motivated by financial incentives and imperial ambitions, turned a blind eye to the methods used to acquire these human resources. The locator system operated with quasi-legal status, existing in the gray area between legitimate recruitment and outright kidnapping. The man in Hamelin represented the sharp end of this system, a field operative trained in the arts of deception and psychological manipulation. His methods were refined through years of practice, honed by observing which techniques proved most effective in separating children from their families and communities. He would spend days in a town before making his move, carefully observing the social dynamics, identifying the most vulnerable targets, orphans with no family protection, children from families struggling with poverty, young people who had aged out of apprenticeships without finding permanent positions. He studied their routines, learned their names, discovered their dreams and fears through casual conversations and careful eavesdropping. The recruitment process began with the establishment of trust and the creation of desire. The locator would tell elaborate stories of opportunities in the Eastern territories, tales of fertile lands waiting to be claimed, of princes who rewarded loyal settlers with grants of property, of cities where skilled workers could earn wages unimaginable in their current circumstances. He painted vivid pictures of freedom from the rigid social hierarchies that trapped them in Hamelin, describing a world where birth circumstances mattered less than willingness to work and adapt. For orphaned children, he offered the promise of new families who would welcome them as sons and daughters. For young men facing lives of agricultural drudgery, he described opportunities to become soldiers in the service of powerful lords, complete with weapons training, regular meals, and the respect that came with military service. The musical performances served multiple functions within this recruitment strategy. They created a festive atmosphere that drew crowds and made the locator's presence seem benign and entertaining rather than threatening. The music also served as a form of psychological conditioning, with specific melodies becoming associated in the children's minds with the promises of adventure and prosperity. Over several days, the locator would play the same haunting tune at different locations throughout the town, creating a form of auditory imprinting that made the children more responsive to his eventual call to action. The moment of departure was carefully orchestrated to minimize resistance and maximize compliance. The locator chose a time when most adults were occupied with their daily labors, typically in the early morning when fathers were in the fields and mothers were busy with household tasks. He positioned himself at the edge of town, near one of the gates that led to the main roads eastward, and began playing his pipe with a particular intensity and urgency that signaled to his prepared victims that the moment of departure had arrived. The children who had been psychologically prepared over the previous days found themselves drawn to the sound, their rational thought processes overwhelmed by the combination of musical hypnosis and carefully cultivated desire for escape from their current circumstances. The physical act of leading the children away involved sophisticated crowd psychology techniques. The locator understood that group dynamics could work in his favor. Once a few children began following him, others would join simply due to social pressure and fear of being left behind. He moved at a pace that was brisk enough to prevent second thoughts, but not so fast as to cause panic or exhaustion. His route was predetermined, taking advantage of natural terrain features that would screen the group from casual observation by townspeople who might raise an alarm. The destination of these human trafficking operations varied depending on current demand and political circumstances. Some children were delivered to military commanders who needed young recruits for frontier garrisons, where they would serve as soldiers, servants, or camp followers in the ongoing campaigns against Slavic populations. Others were sold to agricultural estates that required laborers for the backbreaking work of clearing forests and establishing farms in wilderness areas. The most unfortunate were delivered to slave markets, where they would be sold to the highest bidder, their ultimate fate determined by the whims and needs of their purchasers. The forensic evidence of what actually occurred in Hamelin tells a story far more horrifying than simple kidnapping. It reveals the intersection of human trafficking with epidemic disease, creating a perfect storm of mortality that would haunt the town's collective memory for centuries. The summer of 1284 brought with it an outbreak of murine typhus, a bacterial infection transmitted by fleas that lived on the rats infesting every medieval settlement. The disease, caused by Rickettsia typhi, created a cascade of physiological horrors that began subtly but progressed with terrifying speed. The initial symptoms appeared innocuous enough: a slight elevation in body temperature, mild headaches, and general malaise that could easily be attributed to the heat and humidity of the season. Parents noticed their children seemed listless and complained of feeling tired, but in a society where childhood mortality was commonplace and medical understanding was primitive, these early warning signs were largely ignored. The bacterial infection was silently establishing itself in the victim's bloodstream, multiplying rapidly and beginning its systematic assault on the body's vital systems. Within 48 to 72 hours of infection, the disease entered its acute phase with devastating suddenness. Body temperatures spiked to dangerous levels, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit, causing the victims to alternate between violent shivering and periods of burning fever that left their skin flushed and hot to the touch. The children's eyes became bloodshot and sensitive to light, forcing them to seek darkness in their homes' shadowy corners. Severe headaches, described by contemporary accounts as feeling like iron bands tightening around the skull, left many victims writhing in agony and crying out for relief that would never come. The characteristic rash that gave the disease its association with the Pied Piper's multicolored coat typically appeared on the fourth or fifth day of illness. It began as small, flat, pink spots scattered across the trunk and gradually spread outward to cover the arms, legs, and face. These petechial lesions, caused by bleeding from damaged capillaries beneath the skin, created a mottled, patchwork appearance that contemporary observers would later describe as resembling the particolored clothing worn by the mysterious figure who had appeared in their town. As the disease progressed, these spots darkened from pink to deep red to purplish black, creating the visual impression of a garment made from scraps of different colored cloth. The neurological effects of the infection were perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the epidemic. As the bacteria attacked the small blood vessels in the brain, victims began experiencing severe delirium and hallucinations. Children who had been coherent and responsive just hours earlier suddenly began speaking to invisible companions, describing fantastical visions of music and dancing, and attempting to follow sounds that only they could hear. Some witnesses reported seeing groups of delirious children stumbling through the streets in the early morning hours, their fever-addled minds responding to auditory hallucinations that seemed to call them toward the town's outskirts. The progression from delirium to coma was swift and merciless. As brain swelling increased and oxygen delivery to neural tissue decreased, the victim's consciousness began to fade. Their breathing became irregular and labored, punctuated by periods of frightening stillness that made their families wonder if death had already claimed them. The skin took on a grayish pallor, except for the increasingly prominent rash, and the body's temperature regulation system began to fail completely, causing wild fluctuations between hypothermia and hyperthermia. Death, when it came, was often preceded by seizures that racked the small bodies with violent convulsions. The children's limbs would stiffen and jerk uncontrollably, while foam tinged with blood emerged from their mouths. Their eyes would roll back, showing only the whites, while their breathing became increasingly shallow and rapid. The final moments were marked by a distinctive rattling sound as fluid accumulated in the lungs, creating the death rattle that medieval people recognized as the soul's departure from the body. The mass mortality created logistical nightmares for the surviving population. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be properly buried, and the summer heat accelerated decomposition to the point where the stench of putrefaction began to permeate the entire town. Families who had lost multiple children were too weakened by grief and their own illness to perform proper burial rites. The town's small cemetery quickly reached capacity, forcing the creation of mass graves on the outskirts of the settlement, where dozens of small bodies were interred together in hastily dug pits. The psychological trauma inflicted on the survivors was as devastating as the physical toll of the disease. Parents who had watched their children die in agony were left with memories of their loved ones' final moments. The desperate pleas for water to cool their burning fever, the incoherent babbling as delirium took hold, the terrible stillness that followed the last labored breath. Many survivors reported persistent nightmares in which they heard the voices of the dead children calling to them from beyond the grave, their ethereal songs echoing through the empty streets where laughter had once filled the air. The intersection of human trafficking and epidemic disease created a perfect storm of horror that would be remembered and retold for generations. Some children may have been led away by the locator, only to succumb to typhus during the arduous journey eastward, their bodies left to rot along remote forest paths where no proper burial was possible. Others might have died in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of temporary camps where trafficked children were held before being distributed to their final destinations. The combination of stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to infected rats and fleas would have made these young victims particularly susceptible to the disease's most severe manifestations. The sun rose over Hamelin on the feast of Saints John and Paul in the year of our Lord 1284, casting long shadows through the narrow streets where children would soon walk for the last time. The morning air carried the scent of baking bread and the distant sound of church bells. But beneath these familiar comforts lay something else, a tension that had been building for months, like the pressure before a storm that breaks everything in its path. At the west gate, where merchants and travelers entered the town with their goods and promises, a figure appeared as the morning mist began to lift. The records do not describe his face clearly, for those who saw him were either too young to remember details or too traumatized to speak of them later. What we know is this: he was not the colorful minstrel of children's tales, but something far more ordinary and therefore far more terrible. Perhaps he wore the simple clothes of a labor recruiter, or the modest robes of a religious official, or the practical garments of a merchant promising work in distant lands. His ordinariness was his weapon, the kind of mundane evil that walks among us unnoticed until it is too late. The pipe he carried was not magical. It was likely a simple wooden instrument, the kind used by shepherds or traveling workers to signal and communicate. But in the context of what was to come, this humble tool would become the stuff of nightmares, transformed by grief and guilt into something supernatural because the alternative, accepting the banality of the evil that had visited them, was too much for human hearts to bear. By mid-morning, as the sun climbed higher and the town settled into the rhythm of another day, the figure began to play. The sound drifted through the streets like smoke, reaching into homes where children played and worked alongside their parents. But this was not the enchanting melody of fairy tales. It was something else entirely. Perhaps the promise of work, of adventure, of escape from the grinding poverty that had settled over Hamelin like a shroud. Or perhaps it was simply the sound of authority calling, and children, raised to obey without question, answered that call as they had been taught. One by one, they came. Not skipping and dancing as the sanitized versions would have us believe, but walking with the uncertain steps of young people caught between curiosity and fear. They emerged from doorways and workshops, from market stalls and courtyards, drawn by whatever promise the figure offered. Their ages ranged from small children barely old enough to walk steadily to adolescents on the verge of adulthood, but all shared the same vulnerability that made them perfect targets for whatever scheme was unfolding. The gathering was gradual, almost imperceptible at first. A few children here, a handful there, until the group began to swell with a momentum of its own. Parents, busy with their daily labors, noticed the absence of their children's voices, but perhaps assumed they were playing elsewhere, as children do. The figure moved through the town with practiced efficiency, collecting his human harvest with the skill of someone who had done this before, in other towns, on other feast days when communities were distracted by celebration and ritual. As the group reached 130 souls, a number that would be etched into Hamelin's collective memory like a brand, the figure began to lead them toward the east gate. This was the moment when the ordinary transformed into the unthinkable, when what might have seemed like a gathering of children became a procession toward oblivion. The east gate faced the Koppen, Calvary Hill, where Christ had suffered and died in countless artistic representations. The symbolism was not lost on later chroniclers, who saw in this direction a kind of twisted pilgrimage, a march toward sacrifice. The children followed, And here we must pause to consider what was really happening in their minds. Were they excited by promises of work and wages? Were they frightened, but too afraid to disobey? Were they sick with some disease that clouded their judgment and made them susceptible to manipulation? The truth is that we will never know, because the truth died with them on that hill, leaving only the terrible silence that followed. By noon, the procession had reached the Koppen. From the town below, a few late observers might have seen the dark line of figures moving up the hillside, but distance and heat haze would have made details impossible to discern. What happened next remains one of history's most haunting mysteries, but the possibilities are all equally devastating. Perhaps the children were herded into some natural cave or constructed shelter, where disease or violence claimed them all. Perhaps they were marched further eastward, toward territories where child labor was in demand and questions were not asked. Perhaps they were simply abandoned to die of exposure and starvation, their bodies left to feed the carrion birds that circled the hill. The figure himself vanished as completely as his victims. No record exists of his departure, no witness testimony of his route or destination. He dissolved back into the anonymity from which he had emerged, leaving behind only the absence that would define Hamelin for generations to come. This disappearance, too, speaks to the calculated nature of what had occurred. This was not the work of a madman or a supernatural entity, but of someone who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of a community and then escape the consequences of his actions. As the afternoon wore on and the children failed to return for their evening meals, the first stirrings of alarm began to ripple through the town. Parents called out into empty streets, searched familiar hiding places, questioned neighbors who could only shake their heads in growing bewilderment. The absence grew heavier with each passing hour, until it became a weight that pressed down on every household, every street corner, every familiar place where children's voices should have been heard. By evening, the search had become frantic. Mothers ran through the streets calling names that would never again receive an answer. Fathers organized search parties that combed every alley, every cellar, every possible refuge where children might hide. The search extended beyond the town walls, into the fields and forests, toward the Koppen where the last sightings had been reported. But the hill yielded no secrets, no trace of the 130 souls who had vanished into its shadow. The night that followed was unlike any in Hamelin's history. It was a night of vigils and prayers, of desperate hope and growing despair. Candles burned in windows as families waited for the sound of familiar footsteps that would never come. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of weeping and the hollow echo of voices calling into the darkness. This was the night when Hamelin began to understand that something irreversible had happened, that the world had shifted on its axis and would never return to its former position. Dawn brought no relief, only the harsh clarity of daylight illuminating the magnitude of the loss. The search resumed with renewed desperation, but it was already becoming clear that whatever had happened to the children, they were beyond rescue. The town had been hollowed out, its future stolen in a single morning by forces that remained invisible and incomprehensible. The survivors, the parents, the siblings, the community leaders, were left to grapple with a reality that defied explanation and demanded answers that would never come. In the days that followed, as the search gradually gave way to mourning, the process of mythologization began. It started with small details. The figure's clothing became more colorful in each retelling, his pipe more ornate, his manner more theatrical. The children's departure was reimagined as willing, even joyful, because the alternative, that they had been deceived, coerced, or simply abandoned to die, was too painful to contemplate. The harsh reality of exploitation and loss was gradually wrapped in layers of fantasy and symbolism, until the truth became buried beneath the weight of collective denial. The street where the children were last seen became Bungalosenstrasse, the street without drums, where music and dancing were forbidden. This prohibition was not merely symbolic, but practical, a recognition that certain sounds could trigger memories too painful to bear. The very air of that street had been poisoned by association, transformed into a monument to loss that the community could neither forget nor fully remember. Church windows were commissioned to commemorate the event. But even these artistic representations began the process of transformation that would eventually create the fairy tale we know today. The figure became more fantastical with each artistic interpretation, his victims more willing, their fate more mysterious than tragic. Art, which should have preserved the truth, instead became complicit in its burial, creating beautiful lies to cover ugly realities. The annual commemorations that followed served a dual purpose. They kept the memory of the children alive while simultaneously distancing the community from the brutal facts of their disappearance. Rituals and ceremonies provided a framework for grief while also containing it, channeling the raw pain of loss into acceptable forms of expression that would not threaten the social order or demand uncomfortable questions about how such a thing could have been allowed to happen. But beneath all these layers of myth and ritual, the truth remained. 130 children had been lost to forces that were entirely human, entirely preventable, and entirely ignored by those who had the power to protect them. The colorful Piper of legend was a mask for something far more sinister: the systematic exploitation of the vulnerable by those who understood how to manipulate desperation and innocence for their own ends. This is the verdict that history delivers, though it speaks in whispers rather than proclamations. The innocent story of the Pied Piper was constructed to hide the trauma of a town that lost a generation to exploitation, disease, or forced migration. The colorful musician is a mask for the real horror: the systematic loss of children to economic forces, state manipulation, and the indifference of history. The myth is a monument to denial, a way for Hamelin, and by extension all of us, to avoid confronting the brutal reality behind the fairy tale. We tell ourselves that evil comes dressed in bright colors, playing enchanting melodies that lead the innocent astray through supernatural means. This comforting lie allows us to ignore the truth that evil more often wears the clothes of authority, speaks in the voice of reason, and operates through systems we have created and continue to maintain. The real pipers of our world do not need magic to steal children. They have economics, politics, and the willing blindness of communities that prefer fairy tales to facts. Humanity has always buried its horrors beneath myths, symbols, and stories. The Pied Piper legend is not unique. It is one of countless tales crafted to shield us from the unbearable truth: that children are lost not to magic, but to greed, neglect, and the relentless march of power. Every sanitized retelling erases another layer of suffering. Every colorful illustration obscures another moment of genuine terror. Every cheerful adaptation denies another generation's right to be remembered as they truly were. Victims of a world that valued profit over protection, order over justice, comfort over truth. The world is built on layers of such buried pain, and every time we repeat a sanitized version of history, we erase another generation's suffering and ensure that the same tragedies will unfold again, hidden behind new myths, new explanations, new ways of avoiding the simple, devastating fact that we have always known how to protect our children, and we have always chosen not